I am your host, Mr. Hercule.
Now, shall we begin our little investigation?
It was a Christmas Eve that seemed to have been plucked from the lid of a chocolate box. Though, as I remarked to Hercule Poirot while our taxi crawled through the soup-thick yellow fog of London, the reality was far less picturesque than the illustration. The air was a damp, chilling shroud that muffled the sounds of the city, turning the grand townhouses of Mayfair into ghostly monoliths. "It is the English climate, Hastings," Poirot sighed, adjusting the silk scarf nestled beneath his chin with agonizing precision. "It has no sense of the convenance. It is messy. It is disorganized. It seeks only to ruin the shine on one's patent leather boots and the curl of one's moustache. We were bound for the residence of Sir Alister Sterling, a man whose name was synonymous with the steel industry and a brand of ruthless financial genius that had earned him as many enemies as it had millions. He had extended an invitation to Poirot, and by extension myself, for his annual Christmas Eve gala. It was to be a night of champagne, carolers, and the curated company of London's elite. When we arrived at the impressive Georgian facade in Grosvenor Square, the warmth of the interior offered a sharp contrast to the biting cold. The entrance hall was a triumph of Victorian opulence, dominated by a towering Nordmann fir draped in silver tinsel and real wax candles. Yet, despite the festive decor and the distant swell of a gramophone playing a jaunty foxtrot, an inexplicable heaviness hung in the air. Sir Alister was not there to greet us. Instead, we were met by his butler, a man named Jakes who possessed the frozen countenance of an Arctic explorer. He took our coats with a trembling hand, a detail that did not escape Poirot's sharp, bird-like eyes. "Sir Alister is in the study, Monsieur Poirot," Jakes whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "He requested not to be disturbed until the stroke of 10. However," he hesitated, looking toward the heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hall. "However?" Poirot prompted, his head tilted to one side. "He has not responded to the dinner gong, monsieur, nor to my knocking. The door is bolted from the inside. It is most unlike him. Sir Alister is a man of the most rigid punctuality." Poirot looked at his pocket watch. It was 5 minutes past 10. A small, rhythmic tapping of his finger against his cane was the only sign of his rising interest. A man of habit who breaks his habit, Hastings, is a man who has either found something more important than time or has run out of it entirely. At that moment, a woman's sharp cry rang out from the upper landing. It was Lady Sterling, Sir Alister's much younger, ethereal wife. She stood clutching the marble balustrade, her face as white as the pearls at her throat. "Jakes, why hasn't he come out? He promised we would open the first bottle together." The guests began to spill out from the drawing room, a kaleidoscope of silk, sequins, and stiff white collars. There was Julian Sterling, Sir Alister's nephew and heir, looking flushed with drink, Miss Evelyn Thorne, the sharp-featured private secretary, and Marcus Vane, a business rival whose presence had been the subject of much gossip in the tabloids. "The door, Jakes," Lady Sterling commanded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "Break it down. One moment, madame." Poirot stepped forward, his voice calm yet commanding. "Perhaps we should first attempt the more civilized approach." He approached the study door, leaning his ear against the wood. Silence. Not the silence of a man sleeping or reading, but the heavy, absolute silence of a vacuum. Poirot tried the handle. It was, as Jakes had said, firmly bolted. He knelt, with a small grimace for the state of his trousers, and peered through the keyhole. "The key is in the lock on the other side," he murmured, "and the bolt is thrown." With a nod from Julian Sterling, Jakes and the footman threw their weight against the mahogany. On the third attempt, the wood splintered, and the door swung open with a violent crash. The study was a shrine to masculine success. Leather-bound books lined the walls, and a fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long dancing shadows. Sir Alister sat in his high-backed green leather chair, his back to us, facing the large bay window that looked out onto the fog-drenched square. "Alister," Lady Sterling whispered, stepping into the room. She reached for his shoulder, and as she touched him, the body slumped sideways. Sir Alister Sterling didn't fall to the floor. He remained caught by the arm of the chair, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. His eyes were wide, staring at something invisible in the room, and his face was twisted into a mask of profound, indignant surprise. On the desk before him sat a single glass of tawny port, undisturbed, and a small hand-painted Christmas card that read, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." Poirot moved with a quickness that belied his stature. He did not touch the body. He merely leaned over, sniffing the air like a hound, his eyes scanning the desk, the floor, and the locked window. Is it a heart attack?" Julian Sterling asked, his voice shaking. Poirot straightened up, his expression unreadable. He looked at the assembled guests, all huddled in the doorway, their faces pale reflections of the tragedy before them. "The heart, it has stopped, yes," Poirot said softly. "But not by the hand of nature. Regard the fingernails, the faint scent of bitter almonds beneath the aroma of the port. It is very neat, very contained. A locked room, a house full of friends, and a man dead in the midst of his triumph." He turned to me, his green eyes glowing with a strange inner light. "The festivities have ended before they began, Hastings. We are no longer guests. We are the witnesses to a most deliberate and cold-blooded theatrical performance. The drawing-room, which only an hour ago had been a sanctuary of festive warmth, now felt like a gilded cage. The fog pressed against the tall windows, sealing us within the opulent tomb of Grosvenor Square. Under Poirot's quiet but firm direction, the household had retreated from the grim scene in the study to the flickering firelight of the lounge. Poirot stood by the mantelpiece, looking not at the suspects, but at a pair of porcelain shepherds that were slightly misaligned. With a tiny grunt of dissatisfaction, he adjusted one until it was perfectly symmetrical with its partner. Only then did he turn his attention to the closed circle of the Sterling household. Lady Eleanor Sterling sat upon a velvet chaise longue, a lace handkerchief pressed to her eyes. Even in her grief, or the performance of it, she was strikingly beautiful, her silver silk gown shimmering like moonlight. "It is too monstrous," she sobbed. "On Christmas Eve! Who could have hated Alistair so much to do this? That, madame, is the question that the little grey cells must now address," Poirot said softly. Beside the drinks trolley stood Julian Sterling, the nephew. He had poured himself a stiff brandy with a hand that shook enough to make the crystal decanter chatter against the glass. He was a man who looked as though he had spent his youth chasing horses and bad debts, both of which had clearly caught up to him. "Don't look at me like that, Eleanor," Julian snapped, catching his aunt's watery gaze. "We all know Alistair was a difficult man. He ran this family like one of his steel mills, coldly and with an eye for the scrap heap." "Julian," Miss Evelyn Thorne, the secretary, intervened. She was a woman of perhaps 40, with features as sharp and precise as the shorthand she took for her late employer. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her forehead. "This is hardly the time for your resentments. Sir Alistair was a titan of industry. He was a tyrant, Evelyn, and you were his most loyal foot soldier," Julian retorted. "I wonder, did he leave you? That pension he was always dangling over your head? Or did he change his mind again this morning?" Miss Thorne's lips thinned into a bloodless line. She turned to Poirot. "I have served Sir Alistair for 12 years, monsieur. I managed his correspondence, his appointments, and his secrets. I can assure you there was nothing in his manner today to suggest he expected this. And yet," Poirot remarked, his eyes roaming the room, "someone expected it. To poison the port in a room locked from the inside, it is a feat of great precision. It requires the time, the opportunity, and the knowledge of Sir Alistair's most intimate habits." At the edge of the firelight sat Marcus Vane. He was the only person in the room who seemed entirely unmoved by the tragedy. Vane was a tall, rugged man with a reputation for bottom fishing in the city, buying up failing companies and gutting them. His rivalry with Sterling was legendary. They had spent the last decade suing one another into near exhaustion. "I suppose I'm the prime candidate, then?" Vane asked, a thin, sardonic smile playing on his lips. The ancient enemy invited to the Christmas feast. "It's poetic, isn't it? Alistair called me this morning, insisted I come, said he had something monumental to discuss regarding the merger. I arrived, we exchanged pleasantries, and then he dismissed me to his study while he prepared the surprise." "A surprise indeed," I muttered, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "But the door was locked, Monsieur Vane," Poirot pointed out, "and the key, it was on the inside. How does one exit a room that is sealed by the victim himself? Perhaps he wasn't alone when he locked it." Julian suggested, his eyes darting toward Lady Eleanor. He and Eleanor had a row earlier. Something about her extravagances in Paris. Isn't that right, Auntie? Lady Stirling's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a sudden cold fire. Alistair was a jealous man, Julian. He saw ghosts in every shadow. But I was in my dressing room with Marie from 8 o'clock until the guests arrived. I have a witness. And I was in the library checking the market closing, Miss Thorne added quickly. And I, Vane said, was right here in the drawing room, admiring the silver and wondering why I'd bothered to come. Poirot paced the length of the rug, his patent leather shoes clicking rhythmically. Everyone has a place, everyone has an alibi, and everyone has a motive. The nephew with the debts, the wife with the extravagances, the secretary who knows the secrets, and the rival who stood to lose a fortune if the merger went through. He stopped in front of the Christmas tree, squinting at a glass bauble that hung slightly lower than the others. The fog outside is very thick, Poirot mused. It hides the world, but inside this house the light is very bright, and yet I perceive that everyone is standing in the shadows. You all wear the masks of the holiday, but underneath, underneath, the psychology is most fascinating. He turned back to the room, his expression suddenly grave. Jakes tells me the police are delayed by the weather. We are alone with a murderer. I suggest, mesdames and messieurs, that we do not pretend otherwise. The peace on earth of which the card spoke, it has been murdered along with Sir Alistair. The study had been left exactly as it was when we broke down the door, save for the heavy silence that now seemed to press against the eardrums. The body of Sir Alistair Stirling remained in that awkward, tilted slump, a silent testament to a life cut short in its prime. Poirot entered the room not with the frantic energy of a Scotland Yard inspector, but with the measured, delicate steps of a man entering a cathedral. "Order and method, Hastings," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "Without them the truth is merely a pile of mismatched buttons." He began by approaching the desk. He did not touch anything Poirot had a profound distaste for, disturbing the ensemble of a crime scene. Instead, he leaned over the glass of port, his nostrils quivering. He then turned his attention to the Christmas card. It was a simple thing, yet in this room of dark wood and cold steel, it looked garishly cheerful. "Observe, Hastings, the card is positioned exactly in the center of the blotter, not a millimeter to the left nor to the right. For a man who was, by all accounts, surprised by a sudden and agonizing death, Sir Alistair seems to have maintained a remarkable sense of geometry. Perhaps he was looking at it when the poison took effect," I suggested. "Perhaps," Poirot murmured, "but look at the handwriting on the envelope, which lies discarded in the waste-paper basket." He fished it out with a pair of silver tweezers he kept in his pocket. A feminine hand, wouldn't you say? Elegant, yet with a certain aggressive slant to the letters. He moved to the door we had broken down. He examined the splintered wood and the heavy brass bolt with an expression of profound melancholy. To lock oneself in. It is an act of a man who seeks privacy. But why seek privacy to drink a glass of port on Christmas Eve when your guests are waiting in the drawing room? It is a contradiction, and the contradictions, they are the signposts of the truth. I watched as he moved to the large bay window. The fog was so thick now that the glass appeared to be painted a dull, opaque grey. Poirot checked the latches, firmly fastened from the inside. The chimney is too narrow for even a small child, let alone a murderer. So we have a room that is a box that is sealed, and yet the death it enters. It must have been the port, Poirot, I said, if the poison was already in the decanter. But the decanter is in the drawing room, Hastings. I saw it myself on the sideboard. Everyone drank from it. Sir Alistair's glass was the only one that contained the bitter almond of the cyanide. This means the poison was added to the glass after it was poured. Or perhaps the glass itself was prepared. Poirot suddenly straightened his back and began to meticulously brush a speck of dust from his sleeve. "The physical evidence, it tells us the how. It is ingenious, yes, but the why, that is where the little grey cells must labour. Consider Sir Alistair, a man of steel, a man who breaks others. Would such a man sit quietly and wait for his end? Look at his face, Hastings. What do you see?" I looked at the dead man's features. The indignant surprise Poirot had mentioned earlier was still there. "He looks offended," I noted. "Precisely. He was not afraid. He was not in despair. He was insulted. It is the expression of a man who has been outwitted by someone he considered his inferior. Poirot began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Let us reconstruct the psychology. Sir Alister enters this room. He is expecting someone, or perhaps he is expecting a monumental event, as Monsieur Vane suggested. He bolts the door, he pours a drink, or does he? If he was expecting a guest, why bolt the door against them? If the guest was already inside, how did they leave? There are no secret passages in these Mayfair houses. The walls are too thin and the taxes too high. He stopped in front of a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a younger Sir Alister, standing next to a man who bore a striking resemblance to Julian Sterling, though with a much firmer jawline. The family history, Poirot sighed. It is always the family history. Jakes! The butler appeared at the door almost instantly, his face still ashen. Yes, monsieur, tell me, Jakes. When Sir Alister retired to this study, did he take the port with him, or was it brought to him? He took the glass himself, monsieur. He poured it in the drawing-room in full view of the company, and then he walked in here. He said he had business with a ghost and did not wish to be disturbed. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A business with a ghost. On the night of the birth of Christ. Most evocative. He turned back to me, a small triumphant smile playing on his lips. You see, Hastings, the how is becoming clear, and the how is very, very clever. But it is the ghost that interests me now. We must find out which of our friends in the drawing-room has been playing the part of the phantom. He adjusted his tie in the reflection of the window. Come, Hastings. We shall go and speak with the secretary, Miss Thorne. I suspect her shorthand contains more than just business dictation. We found Miss Evelyn Thorne in the small library adjacent to the drawing-room. It was a functional space, filled with filing cabinets that looked out of place against the ornate moulding. Miss Thorne was seated at a desk, her hands folded neatly atop a blotter, her expression one of frozen competence. She did not look like a woman who had just lost her employer. She looked like a woman waiting for a meeting to begin. Please, mademoiselle, do not rise, Poirot said, waving a hand as he settled into a chair opposite her. I took my place by the door, notebook in hand. In times of tragedy, the routine is the only thing that preserves the sanity, is it not? I have work to do, Monsieur Poirot, she replied, her voice clipped. There are cables to be sent, boards to be notified. Sir Alister would not have wanted the machinery of sterling steel to grind to a halt simply because his own heart had done so. A titan of industry, Poirot mused. But even titans have their, shall we say, softer moments. Tell me about the Christmas card on his desk. The one that spoke of peace and goodwill. Miss Thorne's eyes flickered, a brief, sharp movement like the shutter of a camera. I don't know anything about a card. Sir Alister was not a man for sentiment. He found the holidays an inefficient distraction. If there was a card, it did not pass through my hands. How very curious, Poirot said, leaning forward. For you are the filter through which all his communications passed. If it did not come through you, then it was delivered by hand. Or perhaps placed there by a ghost. Miss Thorne stiffened. I heard what Jakes said. Sir Alister was prone to theatricality when he was stressed. He'd been under a great deal of pressure lately regarding the Vane merger. He called it business with a ghost, because the deal involved the acquisition of a company he had destroyed 20 years ago, Holloway and Sons. It was a ghost of his own making, and was he haunted by this ghost, mademoiselle? He was annoyed by it. There had been letters. Anonymous ones. They didn't come to the office, they were sent here, marked personal. He burned them in the study grate, but I saw the charred remains. He was being reminded of things better left forgotten. Poirot stroked his moustache, his eyes narrowing. You have been with him 12 years. You have seen the rise of the empire. You have also perhaps seen the skeletons in the closet. For instance, the matter of the nephew's debts, or the expenses of Lady Sterling? Miss Thorne's composure wavered for the first time. A faint flush touched her sallow cheeks. It is not my place to gossip about my employers. Mademoiselle, this is not gossip, it is a matter of the gallows, Poirot said with a sudden, chilling gravity. A man is dead in a room with a bolted door. To find the key to that door, I must first find the key to the people in this house. You mentioned Sir Alister was a tyrant. Tyrants often create a desire for liberation in those they rule. Did you feel the need for liberation, Miss Thorne? I understand your pension was a matter of frequent debate. She pulled herself up, her spine as rigid as a ruler. "I am a professional. My feelings are irrelevant. I did my duty. If Sir Alistair chose to use my future security as a leash, that was his prerogative. But I would not kill the man who held the checkbook. That would be, as I said, inefficient." "Logic," Poirot sighed. "You appeal to logic. It is a language I admire. But tell me this, when the port was poured in the drawing room, where were you?" "I was in here, as I told you. I was finishing the minutes from the afternoon session. I heard the others laughing in the hall. I heard Julian complaining about the quality of the cigars. I did not leave this room until Jakes rang the gong for dinner." "And the library door? Was it open?" "No. I prefer the silence." "So you saw no one pass? You heard no one enter the study?" "The walls are thick, monsieur. I heard nothing but the clock." Poirot stood up, his gaze lingering on a stack of files labelled Holloway and Sons. "One final thing, Miss Thorne. The glass of port, you are certain Sir Alistair poured it himself?" "I saw him do it. He was quite particular about his port. He said Marcus Vane didn't know a vintage from a vinegar, and that he would enjoy his final glass in peace." Poirot paused at the door. "His final glass." Those were his words? Miss Thorne hesitated, her eyes darting to the files. "He meant the final glass of the evening, monsieur. He was tired." "Of course," Poirot murmured, bowing slightly. "The exhaustion of the Titan. It is a heavy burden." As we stepped back into the hallway, Poirot turned to me, his expression grim. "She is a very clever woman, Hastings. She hides her heart behind a wall of glass. But even glass, if hit at the right angle, will shatter. She knows more about that ghost than she admits. And did you notice the ink on her fingers?" "I can't say I did," I admitted. "Fresh blue ink? Yet the minutes on her desk were typed. Why would a secretary have ink on her fingers if she has been typing all evening?" Before I could answer, the front door bell rang, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the gloom. Poirot checked his watch. "Ah," he said, "the law arrives. But I fear Inspector Japp will find this fog has settled inside the house as well as out." Inspector Japp arrived with the suddenness of a thunderclap, followed by two stolid constables who looked remarkably out of place among the Louis XIV furniture. Japp was a man of the earth, blunt, energetic, and possessed of a profound skepticism toward anything he couldn't see, smell, or handcuff. He stamped the London slush from his boots onto the expensive Persian rug and gave Poirot a look that was half affectionate and half exasperated. "I might have known I'd find you here, Poirot," Japp grunted, shedding his damp overcoat. "Whenever there's a billionaire found dead in a locked room on a holiday, you were usually already sitting by the fire waiting for the kettle to boil. What we got? A heart attack that isn't a heart attack?" "Cyanide, Japp." "In the port," I explained, though Poirot merely nodded toward the study. "Cyanide, eh?" Japp marched into the scene of the crime. He spent 10 minutes poking around with a magnifying glass, sniffing the air, and grunting at the broken door. When he emerged, he looked remarkably satisfied. "Well, it's a nasty business, but not exactly a three-pipe problem, is it?" The room was locked from the inside. The victim poured his own drink. It looks like a classic case of the old man's way out. Suicide, plain and simple. Maybe the steel market wasn't as solid as his name. Suicide? Poirot's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "My dear Japp, look at the face of the deceased. Does that look like the countenance of a man who has made his peace with the great beyond? He is not peaceful. He is trefache. He is insulted. A man does not commit suicide with an expression of such profound indignation. People do strange things when they're dying, Poirot," Japp countered, undeterred. "But if you want a murderer, I've already got one gift wrapped for me. We found this in the pocket of an overcoat in the cloakroom, the one with the JS initials on the lining." Japp produced a small brown glass vial with a pair of tweezers. The label was partially torn, but the word potassium was clearly visible. "Julian Sterling," Japp said, a predatory glint in his eye. "The nephew. We did a quick check. He's been dabbling in amateur photography, uses these chemicals for developing. He's also about £10,000 in the hole to a bookie in Southwark. Sir Alistair was going to cut him off tonight. It's the oldest story in the book. He signalled to his constables, who moved toward Julian Sterling. The young man went ashen, the glass of brandy he was holding slipping from his nerveless fingers and shattering on the floor. "That's not mine!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "I mean, the coat is mine, but I've never seen that bottle in my life. I haven't touched my photography kit in months." "Save it for the station, son," Japp said, not unkindly. "You had the motive, you had the means, and you were the last one to see him besides Jakes. You probably slipped it into his glass while he was pouring the round in the drawing room. But the door, I protested. The door was bolted from the inside, Jap. If Julian poisoned him in the drawing room, why did Alistair go into the study and lock himself in? Simple, Jap shrugged. The poison was slow acting. Alistair felt ill, went into his study for a quiet lie down, locked the door so he wouldn't be disturbed by the party, and then, bang, toppled over before he could call for help. It was a neat, logical theory. It accounted for the evidence, the motive, and the physical constraints of the room. Lady Stirling began to weep afresh, and Marcus Vane watched the proceedings with a look of clinical interest. "It is a beautiful theory, Jap," Poirot said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a silk thread. "It has the symmetry, the simplicity, and the common sense that the British public loves so dearly. There is only one small problem with it." Jap sighed. "Here we go. What's the problem, Poirot?" The card, Poirot pointed a gloved finger toward the study. The Christmas card on the desk. If Sir Alistair felt the onset of a deadly poison, a poison that, I might add, usually acts with the speed of a lightning bolt, would he take the time to center a greeting card perfectly on his blotter? And would he, while dying, ensure that the bottle of port remained untouched on the sideboard in the other room? "Maybe he was a tidy man," Jap muttered. "He was a man of order, yes," Poirot agreed. "But Julian Stirling is a man of chaos. Look at him, Jap. He cannot even keep his tie straight or his glass in his hand. Would a man so disorganized be so clever as to plant a slow-acting dose and then leave the vial in his own coat? No. The psychology is wrong. The ensemble is incorrect. If it wasn't the nephew, then who was it? And how did they get out of that room?" Jap demanded. Poirot turned his gaze to the window, where the fog seemed to be thickest. "The murderer did not need to leave the room, Jap, because I suspect the murderer was never truly inside it to begin with. You have found the how that was intended for you to find, but you have not yet seen the how that was hidden in plain sight." He turned to the room at large, his green eyes flashing. "Monsieur Julien, you will stay. Jap, you will wait. I have a small experiment to conduct. I require a piece of string, a candle, and the absolute silence of this house." Jap gave a short, disparaging laugh, but he signaled his men to stand down. He knew from long, sometimes painful experience that when Poirot began to talk of experiments involving household sundries, there was usually a method to his madness. "Very well, Poirot," Jap said, checking his own watch. "I'll give you 20 minutes, but after that I'm taking young Stirling to the yard. Locked room or no locked room, the vial in the pocket is a smoking gun in my book." Poirot did not seem to hear him. He was already directing Jakes with the air of a theatre manager. "A piece of fine silk. Thread, if you please, Jakes, black or dark blue. And a candle, one of the long tapered ones from the dining table. Also, a small amount of sealing wax from Sir Alistair's desk." The suspects watched with varying degrees of bafflement and dread as the items were gathered. Poirot took the silk thread and, with agonizing slowness, began to measure the gap between the door and the frame of the broken study entrance. He then lit the candle, watching the flame steadily in the draughty hall. "What on earth is he doing?" Julian whispered to me, his face still ghostly. "Does he think he's going to conjure Alistair's spirit?" "He is looking for the logic of the impossible, Julian," I replied, though in truth I was just as mystified. Poirot turned his back to the study and stood in the center of the hallway, facing the drawing-room door. He held the silk thread between his fingers, letting it dangle. "You see, mes amis, the problem of the locked room is not a problem of the lock, it is a problem of the mind. We assume that because the bolt was thrown from the inside, the murderer must have been inside. But the mind, the clever, psychological mind, knows that the eye can be deceived by the most simple of tricks." He looked directly at Marcus Vane. The businessman had not moved from his spot by the fire. He held a fresh cigar, unlit, turning it over and over in his long calloused fingers. "Monsieur Vane," Poirot said, his voice dropping to a confidential purr, "you are a man who appreciates a good mechanism, are you not? You build bridges, you forge steel. You understand how parts must fit together to create a whole." Vane's eyes narrowed. "I deal in reality, Poirot, not in parlor tricks with string and wax." "And yet," Poirot countered, "this murder was a parlor trick of the highest order. Consider the Christmas card. It was placed so perfectly. To place something so perfectly, one needs light, one needs time, one needs a lack of fear. Poirot began to walk in a slow circle. Around the suspects, his eyes never leaving their faces. He was like a cat circling a group of nervous sparrows. Lady Eleanor, you told us you were in your dressing room. Miss Thorne, you were in the library. Monsieur Vane, you were here. And yet, the ghost of which Sir Alister spoke, the ghost of Holloway and Sons, walked through these halls. He stopped in front of Lady Eleanor. The card, madame. It was hand-painted, a very delicate scene of a snow-covered church. It reminded me of the artwork one finds in the boutiques of Paris. You were in Paris recently, were you not? Lady Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, her pearls clinking softly. Yes, I was there in November. But what does a card have to do with Alistair's death? Everything, Poirot whispered. Because the card was not a greeting, it was a signal that the ghost had arrived. He suddenly turned and performed a sharp, bird-like tilt of his head, looking toward the dark corner of the hallway, where a large, ornate grandfather clock stood. The pendulum swung with a heavy, rhythmic thud-thud. Monsieur Vane, Poirot said suddenly, when you arrived this evening, did you bring a gift for Sir Alister, a token of the monumental merger? Vane laughed, a dry, rasping sound. I brought him my presents. That was more than he deserved. We were to sign the preliminary papers tonight. He had them in his study. Ah, the papers. Poirot's eyes lit up, the physical reality of the Steel Empire. And where are these papers now, Jap? Jap frowned. We looked. The desk was clear except for the blotter, the card, and the glass of port. Then the ghost has a very practical interest in the steel industry, Poirot remarked. He took the candle and walked toward the grandfather clock. He didn't look at the face of the clock. He looked at the floor beneath it. He knelt, the silk thread still caught between his fingers. He stayed there for a long moment, silent, his back to us. The tension in the hall was nearly physical. I saw Miss Thorne's grip tighten on her notebook until her knuckles were white. Julian Sterling was sweating despite the chill. Slowly, Poirot stood up. He did not look triumphant. He looked profoundly sad. He blew out the candle, and the thin trail of smoke curled upward into the fog-laden air. The experiment is complete, Poirot announced. I have found the how. It was, as I suspected, a matter of the most exquisite symmetry. But the who requires one more piece of the puzzle, a piece that is currently missing. Missing? Jap barked. What's missing? The second glass, Jap, Poirot said, his eyes scanning the floor. Sir Alister was a man of habit. He would never drink alone when he was conducting business, even with a ghost. There is a ring of moisture on the mahogany desk that does not belong to his glass. Someone else was in that room, someone who drank with him, watched him die, and then vanished through a door that was bolted from the inside. A sudden muffled crash from the floor above made us all jump. It came from the direction of the servants' quarters. "Jakes!" Poirot cried, his voice losing its calm. "To the back stairs! Quickly!" We raced up the narrow, uncarpeted back stairs with a speed that left me breathless, and even Jap puffing like a steam engine. Poirot, despite his stature and his notorious aversion to physical exertion, led the way, his patent leather boots clicking sharply against the wood. The air grew colder as we ascended toward the servants' quarters, the festive warmth of the lower floors replaced by a draughty, sterile chill. The crash had come from the end of the narrow corridor, behind a door that stood slightly ajar. Poirot did not hesitate. He flung the door open. It was the room of Marie, Lady Sterling's personal maid. The scene inside was one of chaotic intrusion. A small vanity table had been overturned, spilling powders and pins across the linoleum. In the center of the room, Marie lay slumped against the foot of her narrow iron bed, her breathing heavy and labored. "Is she—" I began, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Drugged, not dead," Poirot muttered, kneeling beside her with a grace that ignored the dust. He lifted her eyelids, then sniffed a small overturned glass on the floor. The same bitter almonds, Hastings, but in a much smaller dose. Mixed with a sedative. Someone did not want her to die, they merely wanted her to be silent. Jap, meanwhile, had moved to the window. It was wide open, the yellow fog swirling into the room like a living thing. He leaned out, squinting into the gloom. There's a fire escape right outside. The killer must have come up here to silence her and then made their break. It leads down to the mews." He began to climb out, but Poirot's voice stopped him, a voice like a whip crack. "Do not bother, Jap. No one has descended that fire escape tonight. Look at the soot on the sill. It is undisturbed. The fog, it plays tricks on the eyes, but it cannot hide the absence of a footprint." "Then where are they?" Jap demanded, turning back, his face flushed. "If the girl's drugged and the window's open, it's a clear getaway. It is a mise-en-scene, Jap." "Another performance," Poirot said, standing up and brushing his knees. He began to scan the room, his eyes coming to rest on a small, locked wooden box on the shelf. The lock had been forced. The girl, she saw something, or perhaps she possessed something that the ghost required. Marie groaned, her head rolling to the side. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with a terrifying confusion. "The woman," she whispered, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. "The woman in the veil. She was in the study, with the master." "What woman, Marie?" I asked, leaning closer. "Was it Lady Sterling?" "No," Marie breathed, a tear tracing a path through the powder on her cheek. "Not my lady. The other one, the one from the letters. She came through the fog. She had no face, only the black lace. She drifted back into unconsciousness before we could press her further." Jap looked at me, then at Poirot. "A woman in a veil? Through a locked door? This is getting ridiculous. It sounds like a ghost story, just like Sterling said." "It is not a ghost story, Jap. It is a tragedy of the past," Poirot said. He had reached into the forced wooden box and pulled out a single, crumpled piece of paper. It was a photograph, old and yellowed at the edges. It showed a group of workmen standing outside a factory gate. In the center stood a young, arrogant Alistair Sterling, and beside him, a woman with a hauntingly familiar gaze, the same sharp, intelligent eyes I had seen earlier this evening. "Holloway and Sons," Poirot read the inscription on the back. "And look at the date. December 24th, 20 years ago, the day the factory was closed and the Holloway family was ruined." "That woman," I said, pointing to the figure in the photo. "She looks like a ghost who has grown older, Hastings," Poirot finished. He tucked the photograph into his breast pocket. "The second glass in the study, it was not for a guest. It was for a memory. Sir Alistair was celebrating his greatest conquest, but he did not realize that the conquered have a way of returning when the fog is thick and the heart is cold." He turned toward the open window, the fog dampening his moustache. "The how of the locked room, Jap. It is now perfectly clear to me. It was not a trick of the door, but a trick of the time. But we have a more urgent problem. The papers, the merger documents, they were not in the study and they are not here." Suddenly the sound of a motor car cranking to life echoed from the mews below. Jap swore and ran back toward the stairs. Poirot, however, remained perfectly still. "Let them go, Jap," Poirot called out, though his eyes remained fixed on the small, hand-painted Christmas card he had taken from the study and was now turning over in. His hands. "The bird may fly, but the cage is already closing. There is one detail, Hastings, one tiny asymmetrical detail that I have overlooked until this very second, and it is the most revealing detail of all." "What is it, Poirot?" He held up the card. "The stamp, Hastings. Look at the stamp on the envelope. It has been cancelled twice, once by the post office and once by a drop of blue ink." The chaos following the discovery of Marie and the roar of the departing motorcar seemed to energize Poirot. While Jap and his men were occupied with the logistics of a pursuit they had already lost, Poirot returned to the drawing room. He did not look for clues on the floor or for hidden microphones behind the heavy velvet drapes. Instead, he stood before the magnificent Christmas tree, his head tilted at that peculiar angle that signaled his little grey cells were working at a fever pitch. "The order, Hastings," he whispered, gesturing to the tree. "Consider the order, the silver tinsel, the wax candles, the hand-blown glass ornaments. It is a masterpiece of symmetry, is it not?" "It's a very fine tree, Poirot," I said impatiently. "But surely we have more pressing matters? A woman has been drugged, a murderer is fleeing in a motor car, and Sir Alistair lies dead in a room that was supposedly impenetrable." Poirot stepped closer to the tree, his eyes fixed on a large silver bell hanging near the center. It was a beautiful thing, but it hung at a slightly different angle than its neighbors. He reached out a gloved finger and touched it. It didn't chime. It gave a dull, heavy thud. Observe the displaced ornament, Hastings. In a house of such rigid perfection, why is this one bell so unhappy? He unhooked the bell and turned it over. Tucked inside the silver cone was a small, tightly folded scrap of blue paper. Poirot didn't open it immediately. He held it to his nose and inhaled deeply. "The scent of lavender," he murmured, "and the texture of high-quality vellum. Miss Thorne's stationery. You think the secretary hid a message in a Christmas ornament?" I asked, incredulous. "I think, Hastings, that we have been looking at a masterpiece of misdirection. We saw a locked room and assumed a miracle. We saw a vial in a coat and assumed a culprit. We heard of a ghost and assumed a phantom, but the truth is much more domestic." He walked back toward the study and I followed, my mind racing. The fog outside seemed to have seeped into my own brain. Poirot stopped at the broken door and looked at the bolt. He then looked at the grandfather clock in the hall, then back at the desk where the glass of port sat. "The blue ink, Hastings. Do you remember the blue ink on Miss Thorne's fingers? And the stamp on the envelope that was cancelled twice? I remember you mentioning them, but I don't see the connection. It is the connection of the double performance." The card was not sent through the mail. It was a card that had already been used, perhaps a card sent to Sir Alister years ago. The stamp was already cancelled by the post office, but to make it look as though it had arrived today, fresh from the ghost of the past, someone had to cancel it again with a blot of ink to hide the original date, and that someone, in their haste, used the very ink that was on their fingers. Poirot's eyes were like green fire now. The locked room, Hastings. It was a trick of the most childish simplicity. It was not locked from the inside by a man who was alone. It was locked from the outside by a person who used the silk thread and the candle wax to throw the bolt after they had exited. I have seen it before, in a case in the Ardennes, but here it was done with a specific psychological purpose. To make us think it was suicide? No, Poirot said, shaking his head. To make us think it was impossible. Because if it is impossible, we look for the supernatural, we look for ghosts. And while we look for ghosts, the very real, very human motive walks out the front door with the merger papers in their pocket. He looked at the small blue scrap of paper he had taken from the bell. "This is the final piece, Hastings, the how I knew, the who I suspected, but this gives me the why. It is a confession, but not the kind you are imagining." He tucked the paper into his pocket and straightened his jacket. "Jap will return soon, empty-handed and angry. The motorcar was a feint, a distraction to draw the police away from the house. The murderer is still here, Hastings. They are waiting for the fog to lift, thinking they have played the perfect game against Hercule Poirot." "But who, Poirot? Who could have done all this? Julian, Vane, Lady Sterling?" Poirot smiled, a small, sad smile. "The person who understands the value of a ghost better than anyone else. The person who has spent 20 years waiting for this specific Christmas Eve. Come, Hastings, we must ask Jakes to prepare the drawing room. It is time for the final gathering. The masks must come off, even if it ruins the festive spirit." He paused, looking at the broken study door one last time. "It is a pity, really. I do so enjoy the carols. But tonight, the only music will be the sound of the truth, and I fear it will be quite discordant. Would you like me to proceed with Section 9, the drawing room inquisitio?" The drawing room had grown cold, the fire sinking into a bed of grey ash that mirrored the pallor of the faces gathered within. Inspector Japp had returned 10 minutes prior, his face a mask of frustrated rage. The motor car had been found abandoned 3 streets away, empty save for a driver's cap and the lingering scent of cheap tobacco. It was, as Poirot had predicted, a hollow diversion. "Everyone is here, Japp," Poirot said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. He stood in the centre of the rug, the silver bell from the Christmas tree resting on a side table next to his folded silk handkerchief. "The doors are closed, the fog is thick, and the truth is at last ready to step out from the shadows." Lady Eleanor sat rigidly, her eyes fixed on the silver bell. Julian Sterling paced like a caged animal, while Marcus Vane watched. Poirot with a look of cold, clinical amusement. Miss Thorne remained by the desk, her posture as straight as a ledger line, her ink-stained fingers hidden in the folds of her skirt. "We began this evening with an impossibility," Poirot commenced, his hands joined behind his back. "A man dead in a room bolted from the inside, a locked room that suggested the supernatural, a ghost of the past taking its revenge. It was a very pretty play, was it not? It was designed to make us look for phantoms instead of people." "But the bolt was thrown, Poirot," Japp interrupted. "We saw it. We had to break the door down." "Precisely, Japp. And that was the first and most vital part of the performance. A simple piece of silk thread, a small bead of sealing wax, and the steady hand of someone who knows the mechanics of a door. The thread is looped around the handle of the bolt, passed through the gap between the door and the frame, and pulled from the outside once the door is closed. The wax holds the thread just long enough to throw the bolt. Then the thread is pulled free, leaving nothing behind but a tiny, invisible scratch. It is a trick for a schoolboy, yet it creates a miracle for the mind." "So the killer walked out of the door and then locked it?" I asked. "Exactly, Hastings. But to perform such a trick, one must have the time, and to have the time, one must ensure that no one is watching. This brings us to the psychology of the ghost. Why the hand-painted card? Why the business with a ghost? Because the murderer needed Sir Alister to want to be alone. They needed him to bolt the door himself, or to appear to have done so, to provide the perfect cover for his own execution." Poirot turned his gaze toward Marcus Vaughan. "You, Monsieur Vaughan, spoke of a merger, a monumental deal involving Holloway and Sons, a company Sir Alister destroyed 20 years ago today, a day of ruin for many, but a day of triumph for a man of steel." Vane shrugged. "He was a shark, Poirot. He ate the smaller fish. It's the way of the world, is it? Or is it the way of the world that the smaller fish eventually develop a very long memory?" Poirot picked up the silver bell. "I found a message inside this ornament, a piece of blue vellum stationery, the kind used by Miss Thorne for Sir Alister's private correspondence. It was not a confession, it was a list of names, the employees of Holloway and Sons who took their own lives after the factory closed, and at the top of that list was the name Evelyn Holloway." The room went deathly silent. Miss Thorne did not move. Her face remained a mask of stone. "You see," Poirot continued, his voice softening with a touch of genuine pity, "we assume that people are who they say they are. We assume a secretary is merely a secretary. But Evelyn Thorne is not just a secretary. She is the daughter of the man Sir Alister bankrupted. She has spent 12 years in this house, eating his bread, typing his letters, and waiting for the perfect night, the anniversary of her father's disgrace." "That's a lie," Miss Thorne said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "I have no connection to the Holloways." "Then why the blue ink, mademoiselle?" Poirot stepped toward her. "The ink on your fingers matches the ink used to cancel the stamp on the Christmas card, a card you found in the old files of Holloway and Sons which you have been keeping in the library. You created the ghost. You sent the anonymous letters. You made Sir Alister so paranoid that he welcomed the privacy of his study to face his past. And when he poured that glass of port, you were already there, weren't you, hiding behind the heavy velvet curtains, waiting for the moment he turned his back." "The door was locked," Julian shouted. "If she was in there, she'd have been trapped." "She was not in there when the door was broken," Poirot replied. "She was the one who found the body after Jakes and the footman broke the door. In the confusion, in the darkness of that room, it is a simple thing for a shadow to merge with the crowd." "You have no proof," Miss Thorne said, her eyes finally meeting Poirot's with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Only theories about thread and ink." "Ah, but I have the most important proof of all," Poirot said, reaching into his pocket and producing a small, crumpled piece of paper, the one he had taken from Marie's room. "I have the ghost's signature." The photograph Poirot held was yellowed, the edges curled like autumn leaves, but the image was clear enough to act as a mirror to the past. He walked toward Evelyn Thorne, who remained standing by the library desk, her silhouette sharp against the dark wood. "This photograph, Japp, was not merely a souvenir," Poirot began, his voice dropping to a low, melodic cadence. "It was a blueprint for murder. Marie, the poor maid, saw Miss Thorne taking this from a hidden compartment in Sir Alister's safe earlier this week. She did not know what it was, only that it made her mistress, Miss Thorne, look very different. Marie kept it. perhaps thinking to ask for a small Christmas bonus in exchange for her silence. That was her mistake. "I took nothing," Miss Thorne said, though her voice lacked its earlier iron. "And a photograph of a factory proves nothing. It proves identity, mademoiselle. You arrived in this house 12 years ago with a different name and a face that had been aged by grief. You became the perfect secretary, invisible, efficient, the shadow that keeps the Titan's life in order. But shadows have memories. You waited for this night because it is the 20th anniversary of your father's suicide. You wanted Sir Alistair to die exactly as your father did, alone in a locked room, with the taste of failure in his mouth." Poirot turned back to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the guests. But how to enter a room that the victim himself has bolted? That is where the ghost becomes useful. Miss Thorne did not need to break in. She was invited in. "But the door was bolted from the inside," I exclaimed. "We saw it. Yes, Hastings, we saw a bolt that was thrown, but we did not see who threw it. Think back. Sir Alistair pours a glass of port. He says he has business with a ghost. He enters the study. Miss Thorne is already there, perhaps hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains or having entered through the hall door before he turned the key. He is not surprised to see her. She is his secretary, after all. She tells him she has the monumental papers he requires. They sit, they drink. She pours the poison into his glass from a small vial, the same vial she later slipped into Julian's coat pocket while we were all gathered in the hall after the discovery. Poirot mimed the action of pouring with a delicate flick of his wrist. Sir Alistair drinks. The cyanide works with the speed of a hammer blow. He realizes too late who she is. That expression of indignant surprise, it was for the woman he had ignored for 12 years. He dies. Miss Thorne then performs the final act. She places the card on the desk, the card she had prepared with the blue ink and the old stamp, to suggest a message from the past. She takes the merger papers, the very papers that would have saved sterling steel, and she exits the study into the hallway. "But the bolt, Poirot," Japp barked. "You're back to the bolt." "The silk thread, Japp. It is so simple, it is beautiful." She stands in the hallway, the door nearly closed. She has the thread looped through the handle of the bolt. She pulls it through the gap between the door and the frame. The bolt slides home. She pulls one end of the thread and it slides out from under the door, leaving her on the outside of a locked room. But in her haste, she did not notice that she had stepped in a small puddle of spilled port. She left a faint sticky residue on the grandfather clock as she steadied herself to pull the thread. And then she went into the library and began her shorthand to create her alibi. Miss Thorne gave a short, jagged laugh. "A thread? A smudge? You are a dreamer, Monsieur Poirot. No jury in England will hang a woman on the strength of a Christmas card and a piece of string." "Perhaps not," Poirot conceded, his eyes glinting. "But they will hang a woman who still carries the poison. You see, mademoiselle, you are a creature of habit. You are so tidy, so organized. You could not bring yourself to throw the vial into the fire where it might be found as a melted lump. You did not want to leave it in Julian's coat forever, for fear the police would trace its origin. You took it back from the coat in the confusion of the search, didn't you?" Poirot stepped forward, his hand out. "It is in your stationery box, Miss Thorne, tucked behind the H file. The vial is not quite empty, and the ink on your fingers, the same ink that cancelled the stamp, is also on the cork of that vial. The silence that followed was absolute. Miss Thorne's mask did not break, it simply dissolved. She did not scream or plead. She looked at Poirot with a weary, almost respectful disdain. "He killed my father," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He took everything, the factory, the house, my name. He deserved to die in a room he thought was safe. He deserved to know that a nobody had outplayed him." "And Marie?" I asked, horrified. "She was a greedy little fool," Miss Thorne snapped. "She saw me coming out of the study before the gong. She found the photograph. I gave her enough to keep. Her quiet, nothing more. I am not a monster, Captain Hastings. I am a creditor collecting a very old debt." Japp stepped forward, his face grim, and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Evelyn Thorne, or Holloway, I'm arresting you for the murder of Sir Alistair Sterling." As they led her away, the fog outside finally began to lift, revealing the cold, stark outlines of the square. The ghost of Holloway and Sons had been laid to rest, but the Cost was etched in the shattered lives left behind in the drawing room. The arrest of Evelyn Thorne was carried out with a quiet, almost surgical efficiency. There were no histrionics, no desperate pleas for mercy. She walked between the two constables with her head held high, her spine as unyielding as the steel her father had once forged. As she passed the Christmas tree, she paused for a singular second, her eyes resting on the silver bell Poirot had removed. A ghost of a smile, cold, tragic, and entirely devoid of regret, touched her lips before she disappeared into the swirling remains of the London fog. The drawing room, once the height of Mayfair luxury, now felt hollowed out. The heavy scent of expensive lilies and wood smoke could not mask the lingering bitterness of the revelation. Lady Eleanor had collapsed back onto the chaise longue, her face buried in her hands. She was no longer the poised mistress of the house. She was a woman who had realized that her entire life of comfort had been built upon the scorched earth of other people's lives. "Did you know, Eleanor?" Julian asked, his voice raw. He was standing by the window, watching the tail lights of the police car vanish. "About Holloway? About what Uncle Alistair did?" Lady Eleanor looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Alistair never spoke of his conquests, Julian. He spoke only of his dividends. I was just another acquisition, a trophy to be polished and displayed. I knew he was hard, yes, but I never knew he was a thief of souls." Marcus Vane, who had remained remarkably silent, finally moved. He walked to the sideboard and poured himself a measure of the port, the same vintage that had killed his rival. He held the glass up to the light, inspecting its clarity with a cynical eye. "So, the merger is dead," Vane remarked, his voice devoid of sentiment. "Without those signed documents, and with the scandal that is about to break, sterling steel will be carved up by the creditors within a month." Evelyn. Holloway didn't just kill the man, she killed the empire. "It was the monumental surprise she intended," Poirot said, joining him. "She did not want his money, Monsieur Vane. She wanted his legacy to turn to ash. To a woman like her, that is the only justice that has any flavor." Vane took a slow sip of the wine. "A high price for a 20-year-old grudge. She'll hang for this, you know. The British law doesn't take kindly to poetic justice when it involves potassium cyanide. The law, it seeks the how and the who," Poirot replied, his expression grave. "The why, that is for the heavens to judge. But I suspect that for Mademoiselle Holloway the hanging will be merely a formality. She died 20 years ago, on the day her father took his life. What we saw tonight was merely the ghost finishing the work." Japp returned a few minutes later, mopping his brow with a large checkered handkerchief. "Well, that's that. We found the vial in her stationery box, just as you said, Poirot. And the merger papers were in the library grate, half charred. She'd tried to burn them the moment she heard us coming up the back stairs. She's a cold one, all right. Didn't say a word in the car. She has said all she wished to say, Japp," Poirot sighed. "The story is told. The account is closed." Julian Sterling approached Poirot, looking older and more somber than he had at the start of the evening. "I suppose I should thank you, Monsieur Poirot. If it weren't for you, I'd be the one in that police car. I've been a fool. My debts, my lifestyle, I gave her the perfect person to frame." "It is a common failing, Monsieur Julian," Poirot said kindly, though there was a warning in his eyes. "To be a fool is a luxury the young often permit themselves. But remember, a man who leaves his coat in the hall with his secrets in the pocket invites the world to look inside. Perhaps this Christmas you have received a gift more valuable than an inheritance. You have received your life. Back, see that you do not waste it on the horses." Julian nodded slowly, then turned to help his aunt from the room. Jakes, the butler, stood by the door, his face a mask of professional grief, ready to begin the long task of closing down the house that had ceased to be a home. As the first hint of a grey, cold dawn began to break through the fog, I turned to Poirot. He was staring at the Christmas tree, his gaze fixed on a small, hand-painted ornament, a tiny, fragile bird. "It is a terrible thing, Hastings," he murmured, "to have so much order in the world and so little peace." "At least justice has been done," I offered, trying to find a silver lining in the gloom of the morning. Poirot looked at me, his green eyes shimmering with a deep philosophical sadness. "Justice, Hastings? No. Tonight we have seen only the logic of the heart. And the logic of the heart, it is a very dark and lonely thing. The yellow fog of the previous night had been chased away by a sharp, biting wind that left the streets of Mayfair looking scoured and unnaturally bright. As we stepped out of the Sterling residence, the milkman's cart was already rattling across the cobbles of Grosvenor Square, a mundane, rhythmic sound that seemed to mock the dramatic silence of the house we had just left. Poirot stood on the top step for a moment, fastidiously turning up the collar of his overcoat. He looked at his patent leather boots, which had suffered most grievously from the night's exertions, and gave a small, pained sigh. "The dawn, Hastings, is a most unforgiving light," he remarked, squinting at the pale sun. "It shows the dust on the mantelpiece and the stains on the sole with equal clarity." "It was a brilliant piece of deduction, Poirot," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the crisp morning air. "The thread, the card, the ink. I still can't quite believe how simple the locked room was. It was the psychology of the ghost that really did us in, wasn't it? It is always the—" "Psychology, mon ami," Poirot replied, beginning to walk toward the corner where a solitary taxi was idling. "The human mind, it seeks the complex when it is faced with the uncomfortable. We wanted to believe in a phantom because the reality that a woman could wait 12 years for a single moment of vengeance is much more terrifying. To cultivate a hatred for over 4,000 days, that requires a discipline of the spirit that is truly formidable." He paused, looking back at the grand facade of the Sterling house. Sir Alister thought he had buried the past under a mountain of steel and gold. "But the past is like the ivy, Hastings. It grows in the cracks where the mortar is weak, and the mortar of Sir Alister's life was very weak indeed. He lacked the one thing that keeps a man's house from falling." "And what is that?" I asked. "The regard for the petty details of human feeling," Poirot said. "He saw only the masses, the movements of industry, the power of the strike. He did not see the secretary. He did not see the child of the man he ruined. He forgot that every action, no matter how grand, leaves a ripple that eventually reaches the shore." We climbed into the taxi. Poirot settled himself into the corner, his gloved hands resting on his cane. He looked weary, yet there was a look of profound satisfaction in his green eyes, the look of a man who had tidied a very messy room. "And now, Hastings," he said, "I think we shall return to Whitehaven Mansions. I have a great desire for a cup of hot chocolate, the thick Belgian kind, and perhaps a brioche. I have had quite enough of the English Christmas fare. The plum pudding, it is a density that my estómac finds most regrettable. And the case, Poirot? Will you write to the papers?" "No, Hastings. I shall leave the papers to Jap. He will enjoy the headlines about the Christmas Eve mystery. For me, it is enough to know that the symmetry has been restored. The debt was paid, yes, but the murderer was caught. The balance. It is achieved." As the taxi pulled away, I looked out at the city waking up. Families would soon be gathering around their trees, opening gifts, and celebrating a peace that, in this house at least, had been bought at a terrible price. "You know, Poirot," I mused, "it's a bit sad. After 20 years of waiting, Evelyn Thorne will spend her next Christmas in a cell." Poirot adjusted his moustache with a small pocket comb, ensuring every hair was in its proper alignment. "Do not pity her too much, Hastings. In her own mind she is already won. She destroyed the empire of the man she hated. To a woman of her temperament, the gallows is a small price to pay for the perfect conclusion to her life's work. She was, in the end, a woman of order, just like me. She only lacked the moral boussole to guide her." He tapped the window as we passed a street urchin who was whistling a carol. "Order and method, Hastings. They are the only things that stand between us and the fog. And now tell the driver to hurry. If the chocolate is not at the correct temperature of 80 degrees, the entire morning will be a disaster, and that I could not bear." With a wink and a characteristic shrug of his shoulders, the great detective closed his eyes, leaving the tragedies of Mayfair behind for the simple, structured comfort of a perfect